Throughout the history of organized crime in our country, there have been mobsters who, despite committing deplorable criminal acts as civilians, also serve their country proudly in the armed forces. In some cases, these same men were even decorated with medals for bravery, valor, and sacrifice. This creates an interesting juxtaposition between the reverence with which the citizenry of our country holds our men and women in uniform and the way we both despise and are fascinated by mobsters and organized crime. This is a list of mobsters who serve their country in the armed forces. This is Mobsters in the Military, Part 1. Genero Jerry, Angiulo, United States Navy. Genero Joseph Gerry Angiulo Sr. was born on March 20, 1919, in Boston's North End. Angiulo would parlay a small numbers racket into a large gambling business and multiple nightclubs. After becoming partners with New England Mafia boss Raymond Patriarca, Angiulo would be made into the family and shortly thereafter appointed to the position of underboss. With boss Raymond Patriarca's power base in Providence, this made Angiulo the de facto boss of Boston's North End. Angiulo would become one of the most notable figures in the Boston underworld, where for 20 years he would dominate a number of rackets in Boston. But before any of that, he would enlist in the U.S. Navy after the attack on Pearl Harbor, eventually piloting landing craft to islands in the Pacific theater of the war. Angiulo served 4 years in the Pacific theater and would eventually earn the rate of chief boatswain's mate before the end of the war. Years later, his criminal empire would be brought down by FBI informants and fellow Boston gangsters James Whitey Bulger and Stephen Fleming, who aided the FBI in planning the bugs used to gather evidence against him. After his 2007 death, he was given a Navy funeral complete with honor guard. Albert, the Lord High Executioner, Anastasia, U.S. Army. Albert Anastasia was born Umberto Anastasio on September 26, 1902 in Calabria, Italy, to Bartolomeo Anastasio and Mariana Polastena. One of the founders of the modern American Mafia and a co-founder and later boss of Murder Incorporated, he eventually rose to the position of boss in what became the modern Gambino crime family. He would come to control New York City's waterfront for most of his criminal career, mainly using threats of violence to control the dockworker unions, which included the Longshoremen's Association. In the 1930s and 1940s, Anastasia was the underboss of the Mangano crime family, which was headed by boss Vincent Mangano. By the early 1940s, Albert Anastasia was under tremendous scrutiny by certain law enforcement groups due to his association with Murder Incorporated. However, the beginning of American involvement in the Second World War provided Anastasia with a means to vanish from New York for a while and simultaneously improve his image. He enlisted in the U.S. Army on May 18, 1942, and with his experience on the Brooklyn docks, he proved valuable to the military as an instructor. He was made technical sergeant and assigned to the education of military longshoremen at Indiana Gap, Pennsylvania. The military turned out to be Anastasia's route to U.S. citizenship. He took advantage of a special act of Congress which granted speedy naturalization to aliens serving in the American Armed Forces. Anastasia became a U.S. citizen on June 29, 1943. He didn't mention any of his previous run-ins with the law on his citizenship application. At the end of the following year, he received his discharge due to his advanced age. He was 42 years old at that time. In 1951, Vincent Mangano was made to disappear, with most feeling that he was murdered by the man who would succeed him, his underboss, Albert Anastasia. Anastasia would remain boss of the family until October 25, 1957, when he was murdered, allegedly on the orders of Vito Genovese and Anastasia's own underboss, Carlo Gambino. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn refused to sanction a church burial, so Anastasia would be interred at the Greenwood Cemetery in Greenwood Heights, Brooklyn, which was attended only by a handful of friends and relatives. Salvator Sammy the Bull Gravano, U.S. Army. Salvator Sammy the Bull Gravano was born on March 12, 1945 in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. After a time as an associate with the Colombo family, he would be transferred to the Gambino family and placed under capo Toto Arello. After being made into the Gambino family, he would ally himself with up-and-coming capo John Gotti, and the two, along with mobster Frankie DeChico, would stage a takeover of the Gambino family by murdering then-boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti. Gotti would ascend to the position of boss, and over time, Gravano became his underboss and right-hand man. Gravano would later turn FBI informant after he and Gotti were arrested. He testified against Gotti and numerous others before entering the witness protection program. Sammy Gravano is well known for being the highest-ranking mobster ever to turn state's evidence at that time. However, long before that, he joined the Army in 1964, just as the Vietnam War was starting to heat up. Allegedly, it was Gravano's lawyer that told a judge that his client would join the Army rather than see a prison cell for a burglary arrest. Gravano told his lawyer there was no way he was going into the Army, but his lawyer made the deal with the judge anyway, so Gravano would not have to serve time for his offense. Gravano was drafted anyway, however he would never fight in Vietnam. Gravano spent a lot of his basic training time on KP duty at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, then to Indiana and Fort Meade, Maryland, where he would use his street knowledge to run small-time illegal gambling and loan sharking operations. Despite this, he would receive an honorable discharge after 2 years. Edward Monk Eastman, National Guard of New York, U.S. Army. Edward Monk Eastman was born in 1875 in the Corlears Hook section of the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City. His father, Samuel Eastman, was a Civil War veteran and a wallpaper hanger. He, along with Edward's mother, Mary Parks Eastman, were most likely descendant from English ancestors of the colonial period. By the time Edward was 5, his father had abandoned the family. Mary moved with her children to her father George Parks' home on the Upper East Side. There, Eastman ran with petty criminal gangs in New York in the late 18 and early 1900s. He would start his own crew, and they would become known as the Eastman Gang. The gang thrived in the violent New York underworld at the turn of the century and expanded rapidly, at one point having roughly 1,200 thugs and thieves answerable to Eastman alone. The gang broadened their scope beyond larceny to include running brothels and dealing opium. The gang's muscle also earned the attention of the political bosses of Tammany Hall, and the gang was often sent to rig elections and intimidate voters. In return, Eastman and his gang were paid well and usually protected from police attention. An arrest would be quickly followed by Tammany Hall's lawyers appearing in court. Where legal wrangling didn't get results, bribes and threats often could. Eastman would be arrested numerous times, and with the increased attention the gang was getting, his arrests began to gain more attention as well. Eventually, a shootout with the rival 5 Points gang sent an enormous shock through the public. With Tammany Hall running for cover, Eastman faced his next arrest without the assistance of Tammany's lawyers. He would be imprisoned for his role in a robbery as well as a shootout with a pair of Pinkerton detectives. His sentence would be 10 years in Sing Sing prison. However, after serving 5 years, he would be released. After his release, he became addicted to opium, which he sold as well as used. The opium trade earned him 8 more months at Sing Sing, and an attempt to steal silver sent him to Clinton Correctional Facility at Dannemora for nearly 3 years. He would be released from prison in October of 1917, 6 months after the United States had declared war on Germany. The U.S. was still building up the expeditionary force needed to actively enter the conflict. Eastman enlisted and entered service with the 106th Infantry Regiment of the 27th Infantry Division. His medical examination upon enlistment is the source of an oft-told anecdote in which the doctors could barely believe the network of scars from blades, bludgeons, and bullets that covered his body. He is reported to have answered a question about which wars he had been involved in with the quip, "Oh, just a lot of little private wars around New York." While Eastman had enlisted under an assumed identity, he stood out for his age, prowess, and reportedly outrunning the younger men during training and impressing all with the force of his bayonet strikes on practice dummies. His fellow enlistees would discover his true identity, and after which there would be no more jokes about his age from the younger recruits. He seemed to take on a tough older brother role to his fellow soldiers. The men of the 27th trained at Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina. They learned to build an entire trench network, watch it be shelled, rebuild it, go through gas drills, and suffer the indignity of being judged dead by observers if they so much as showed their heads above the wall of the trench while not actively firing. American forces arrived in Europe in the summer of the following year, and Eastman saw active combat in some of the most decisive and hard-fought battles at the end of the war. The battles where Eastman saw action included the Somme offensive and the breaking of the Hindenburg Line. Eastman had taken to the disciplined life of a soldier very well. Out of necessity, troops were rotated in and out of the trenches to give them a much-needed break from the muddy filth and constant artillery barrages. Eastman requested to stay when his company rotated out to act as a stretcher bearer for the incoming unit. He frequently threw himself into no man's land to rescue and retrieve fallen soldiers of his unit, including his squad sergeant. He gained notoriety for crawling up on machine gun nests at Veerstraat Ridge with a handful of grenades to stop them from shooting at his brothers in arms. He incurred shrapnel wounds to his legs during this encounter. He even insubordinately escaped from a hospital where he had been confined after the injuries to his legs. There it was discovered that he had been gassed and simply had not told anyone. Standard procedure was to keep gas victims under observation until their lungs either recovered or they died. Monk simply left in the confusion so he could return to the front lines with his unit for the action at the Hindenburg Line. Eastman's unit and commanders thought so highly of his service that they compiled a large volume of letters from his officers and fellow soldiers requesting a pardon and reinstatement of his rights and citizenship. Eastman's exploits had gained so much interest in the newspapers that New York Governor Al Smith granted the petition from the 27th Infantry Division. Sadly, Eastman's exemplary combat service to his nation and the high regard in which his fellow veterans held him did not prevent him from entering the illegal bootlegging business after the war. Eastman was just starting to feel out his entry into the opportunity that Prohibition provided when an argument with one of his partners resulted in his death on December 26, 1920. The partner, a Prohibition agent looking to make money on the other side of the law, pulled a gun and shot Eastman several times. Eastman's recent fame and stature as a war veteran brought a great deal of interest from the press. Where the newspapers once eagerly reported on Eastman's criminal exploits, arrests, and trials, they now put the hunt for Eastman's killer in their headlines. Jerry Bowen, the corrupt Prohibition agent who had gunned him down, was swiftly caught, and he confessed to the killing. Eastman's fellow veterans of the 27th ensured that their fallen comrade received a hero's funeral procession they believed he deserved. In an ironic touch, the funeral procession included a police escort.